Hey, let's talk a little bit about international law and how justice functions on this international scale, especially given some of the constraints that we've talked about and how our international system works. So, right off the bat, you may be wondering why it is that international law is a thing. We don't have a world government. We don't have any system in place that can create or enforce law. So, how does it exist? Well, that's what we'll talk about a little bit. So, right off the bat, it is important to acknowledge those facts. We live, as I have used this term way too many times in our class, we live in an international system of anarchy. We don't have these global structures in place to be able to enforce or create laws. There's no legislative branch, despite what, exists in the UN as far as the General Assembly goes. Yes, it is a legislative branch. No, it is not tasked with creating international laws. We also don't have an international executive branch. Again, the UN, sure, we have the Secretariat, but it is not tasked with the enforcement of laws around the world. It's tasked with creating peace and stability, but not punishing any countries that may threaten that peace and stability. We also don't have courts insofar as we understand courts to exist in a multi-branch system of government. So how does any of this stuff work? Where does any of it come from? What exactly is the aspect here that we can talk about when it comes to international law? Well, there are two main bodies of law that exist on an international scale. The first of which is what we'll talk about in this video, which is international public law. So we've seen an increase in this kind of law around the world. And when I, say these things, most of the time I'm talking post-1945. Because obviously having this, post-World War II world where we started to come together, began the process of globalization and started to create these international organizations, things like the UN, we started to come together and start to agree on some norms that we wanted to exist. So most of the body of public law grows out of these norms. It grows out of this necessity for cooperation and essentially cohabitation on the planet. That if we're going to have all of these individual states, they're going to have to get along somehow. So these types of laws, when we're talking about public laws, we're talking about things like the law of the sea. How we agree around the world that your borders extend several miles into the ocean, and then beyond that is what's considered international waters. These are the norms of international diplomacy, how we approach the question of trying to agree on things or trying to avoid wars. Even the question of sovereignty itself, as we've discussed, it's not an easy thing to always define. So coming together and creating a norm around what definition we're going to be using, and therefore how that definition must be respected. And environmental law as well. These are all areas that we have to consider when we're looking at the international scale. It is really the type of law that deals with international problems, or more specifically, problems that can't be solved just on a domestic level. So we come together and we create all of these laws, not by a process of legislative decision making, but by a process of states coming together and figuring out what laws they need to be able to function. So continuing our branching narrative, we'll look at two primary areas of international public law. The first of which is the customary international law. So these are laws that arise out of traditional practice. We see that there are things long before the invention of the United Nations or the creation of any of these more modern treaties. There are long-standing, deeply internalized norms that countries abide by. So think of this as, trade routes. Trade routes existed for centuries without needing some convention or some treaty to come along and say that trade route exists. This provides a large portion of what we consider to be international law. And some of these do rise to the point of being so important that we need to codify them, like the Geneva Convention, where we establish our foundational rules for how war can be committed when it is committed on an international scale, and what you have to abide by as far as our standards that we think should exist. During World War I, we saw the use of chemical weapons widely during the trench warfare period, and we came to an understanding that we don't agree that that is going to be a norm of warfare moving forward. Now, the other side of international public law is treaty law. So these are the written contracts and conventions that exist between countries. These hold significance insofar as they do follow those contract conventions. Both signing sides, or both signing parties to a treaty, understand their obligations and their benefits that they're going to receive from that treaty. And so these act in a form like very strong laws on an international scale. And we see these most often in the area of trade. Treaties, typically insofar as they are binding, require the approval of domestic state actors. Consider under the United States Constitution that the executive branch negotiates treaties with foreign countries, but those treaties must be ratified by the U.S. Senate. So in order for us to enter into any of these treaties, we still have domestic processes in place to ensure that our government continues to uphold these treaties. That's really important because there is a strong norm on the international scale that treaties hold a great deal of value, and that part of a country's legitimacy is that it will uphold any treaties it has entered into with other countries. Breaking a treaty doesn't necessarily carry with it any kind of negative consequences insofar as an international scale goes. And so this honor, or this responsibility that countries have, is really what is relied upon to understand what kind of actions they may take in any future treaties. As you can imagine, the United States exiting a treaty with another country does sort of undermine the ability for the United States to then enter into future treaties with countries who have seen that action. This also holds true for successor governments. So what I mean by that is when the Obama administration enters into a treaty, the expectation is that treaty will continue to be upheld into the Trump administration. Now, I'm not saying, purely that Trump needs to uphold every single treaty that Obama did just because a previous administration instituted it. And something like the Iran nuclear negotiation, sure, we had essentially a treaty that came out of that, but the Trump administration felt that Iran was not upholding its end of the deal, and so chose to exit that agreement. These are things that do happen, but we just have to understand that on principle, there is an expectation that just because the government changes, just because those that are in charge of the government may shift from regime to regime, that those treaties are still going to be upheld and valued by the country itself. So the missing piece here to all of this law is, sure, we understand where these laws come from, but then what happens? How are they enforced? There is no world police force, as much as sometimes we like to say that the United States is, or that the United States likes to think that it is. We don't have a world police force to go around and ensure that these international laws or norms are being followed. So why would states follow these international laws? Why do they have any reason to not just, seek their own self-interest in a temporary fashion, and as soon as the law stops benefiting them, stop following it? Well, there are a few key aspects to talk about insofar as why countries may choose to do this. And I encourage you, as you're listening to each of these, think about them in terms of some of our foundational concepts, theoretically, that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. So the first is that it may be in their self-interest to cooperate with other countries. We understand that, it is difficult difficult to exist in a globalized world purely functioning unto yourself. So the ability to cooperate and the ability to work with other countries can serve a self-interest both in the temporary and the long-term fashion. This kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of reciprocity. Insofar as if you know that a country is going to hold good on its treaties, you may be more likely to enter into a treaty with that country. It helps to build an international reputation that countries are good on their agreements. Upholding this, international law, especially in a time when it may seem counterintuitive to the direct benefit of that country, shows that the country is willing to work on an international scale towards that overall mutual benefit. Sometimes there are also penalties. Sometimes a country will enforce its rules by saying, well, we're going to boycott trade from a certain country, or we're going to institute sanctions on a country. These penalties, it's kind of difficult because we don't have that international enforcement arm. We don't have something to come down and really, impose strict penalties. We can't put the country of Iran in jail just because it doesn't fulfill its end of a bargain. But we can put sanctions on them. We can go to the international community and say, we'd like to see these sanctions put in place. We'd like you to agree that we're going to basically say Iran did something wrong, and so we're not going to trade with them, or we're not going to invite them to the negotiation table on XYZ issue. So these are a form of ways that we can help to enforce these kind of international rules. And the last one is a little more of a nebulous subject, but just the idea that if everyone is doing it, maybe there's something right about it. If the international community in general agrees to something, maybe there is a norm being created there. And that norm then has, an underlying facet that other countries should agree to do it as well. Where do we go if some facet of this law in a pretty big way has been broken? Well, we do have a world court. It doesn't, I said before that we don't have it in the same terms that we would think on the local scale, and it truly isn't. But we do have the International Court of Justice. And this is a court where you can bring case as a country, and only as a country, can bring case against another country. It doesn't have enforcement rights. It really is a place for a third-party, non-biased organization to hear your arguments and to give you some kind of advice or some kind of arbitration on a way that you may resolve your issues. So the ICJ only provides advisory opinions and that kind of arbitration aspect for these international disagreements. If you take a case to the ICJ, it's heard by a panel of 15 international judges who are elected to their positions. And like I said, only states can bring suit in the ICJ. Now, it has a wealth of problems on its own. It is very much so, it lacks that enforcement aspect. It lacks that coordination with something like the United Nations to ensure that its provisions are adhered to. In fact, when you're entering into the ICJ, there's an optional clause you have to sign on to that makes any of its decisions binding. And this clause is very rarely signed by the parties that go to the ICJ. For example, the genocide in Bosnia took place in 1993. And though these countries went to the ICJ for some kind of relief or some kind of arbitration, that arbitration wasn't concluded until 2007. So it takes a very long time for the ICJ to process any of the cases that are brought before it. In fact, in the entire time that it has existed, it's only heard 178 cases to date. To put that in context, think of the U.S. Supreme Court, which hears between 100 and 150 cases every year. So in a very long period of time, we're talking 1947 to 2019, it has only heard a minimal number of cases. So there are some issues that go along with that. So that's a nice overview of some of the public law that exists. Next time, we'll talk a little bit more about the criminal law and how you can violate criminal laws on an international scale. Thanks. Have a good one.